Hey guys, my name is Thomas Ergo. I'm doing my presentation about Daryl Atkins and how his case changed the death penalty in the United States. This case is important because it raises the question of whether someone with an intellectual disability should be executed. It became a major Supreme Court case and it ended up changing laws across the entire country, especially in how the justice system handles mental health. Background of the case. So in 1996, Atkins and another man named William Jones committed a robbery and a kidnapping in Virginia. They targeted a man named Eric Nesbitt. They forced him to withdraw money from an ATM and then drove him to a secluded area in which they found that he was shot and killed. So, an important detail is that both Atkins and Jones gave different stories and blamed each other for who actually pulled the trigger that night, which in this case made it way harder to know exactly what happened that night and raised the question about who was more responsible for that crime. So now we get into the key issues. So the main issue in this case was whether executing someone with a intellectual disability violates the Constitution. The defense argued that it counts as cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment, which you can see that nice little picture if I'm pointing at the right direction. I don't like PowerPoint, but we'll move. We digress from this. So the issue eventually went to the Supreme Court of the United States in the case Atkins v. Virginia, where the court had to decide if this type of punishment was appropriate or not. I would like to know what you think personally, but we have to continue with our slide. So let's go on to the next slide. Evidence. So a major part of this case was the evidence about Atkins' mental ability. So one psychologist actually tested him using the standard IQ test and found his IQ was roughly around 59, which falls within the range of intellectual disability. He also had a long history of struggling in school, failing classes, and being placed in the lower level courses. But there was on the other hand, the prosecution actually brought in a different expert who didn't give a full IQ test, but still claimed Atkins was of average intelligence based on his behavior and the way he answered questions. So this kind of became a battle of the experts where the jury had to decide which opinion they're going to trust. Are they going to trust the psychologist number one or psychologist number two? And that's a huge deal because the outcome could determine if Atkins lives or dies at the end of the day, right? So it's very huge. Justice system evaluation. So this case had clearly several issues with the justice system. First, let's get into the jury. The jury had to rely on two different experts' opinions, which is just outright confusing and difficult to evaluate. Secondly, the prosecution relied heavily on the testimony from Jones, who was the accomplice for the murder, and he actually avoided death penalty by agreeing to testify against Atkins. So that created an incentive for him to just shift the blame to him. Also, the fact that the jury still sentenced Atkins to death, even with the evidence of intellectual disability, it just shows how inconsistent these decisions can be. And, ultimately, overall, it raises serious concern about the fairness and reliability, especially in the cases of death penalty. Supreme Court ruling. So in 2002, the Supreme Court made its decision. They ruled that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities is unconstitutional. Wow, right? Who would have thought? The court explained that that these individuals have reduced culpability, meaning they are less responsible for their actions compared to others. They also said that people with intellectual disabilities are more likely to actually give false confessions or have trouble understanding legal proceedings. And because of these factors, the death penalty is not considered fair punishment. It is cruel and unusual. So the impacts of the case. This decision had a huge impact because it banned the execution of intellectually disabled individuals across the United States. But it also forced courts to take mental capacity more seriously in the death penalty case. However, one issue is that each state still has its own way of deciding who qualifies as intellectually disabled. And, it can lead to inconsistencies and debates. So while the case improved the system, it didn't completely fix everything. So now we're finally here, the conclusion. So overall, the Atkins case changed the criminal justice system by making it more fair and recognizing the importance of mental capacity. At the same time, it shows that there's still challenges like the expert disagreement and the inconsistency standards between states. But overall, it's a strong example of how the system can improve over time, but it also still needs further reforming. But overall, the case was solid and it helped the criminal justice system improve quite a lot. Thank you. Thank you.